When I walk my dog, sometimes we'll come upon a stick, and my dog will see this stick and leap out of the way. Now, this seems like weird behavior, but clearly the dog thinks that something is odd about that stick. Probably the dog thinks it's a snake and then realizes that it's a stick. But the jumping is almost automatic. It's what we would call now an instinct, basically. It's a perceptual error because the stick isn't really a snake. So the belief that the dog forms is false. But it's a useful false belief because in those rare instances when it actually is a snake, the dog will jump out of the way and avoid harm. These are how biases function. They're not really very useful tools for getting at the truth, but they do have a certain amount of survival value. We have biases in the way that we perceive the world with our senses, the way we think about it, and the way we remember it. None of these processes is the way you probably think that it is. In other words, many people tend to think, for example, that when we open our eyes, there's the world as it really is, and we're seeing it directly as it really is. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Perception, cognition, memory, these are all constructed by processes within our brains. And these processes have evolved largely to provide us mechanisms that help us to survive. Here's a quick example. One of the things we tend to do is to generalize. We see a few cases of something and then we draw a general conclusion. And we've looked at this when we talked about inductive reasoning. So, I see a dog with 3 legs and I see another dog with 3 legs and I conclude, oh, I guess all dogs have 3 legs or something like that. Now, generalization is something we do all the time. Why? Well, it makes things quicker. We can draw conclusions more quickly, and it's easy to understand how this could have survival value. For example, imagine it's 200,000 years ago and you're out on the savannah trying to survive and you come across a lion. Well, you don't spend a whole lot of time going, I wonder if this lion's going to eat me. No, you just think lions are dangerous. All lions are dangerous, and you try to get out of there. So you act on a generalization, and that generalization is very useful because it can help you to survive. And in this case, the generalization is correct. I would say it's a pretty safe bet that all lions are potentially a threat to us. However, lots of times we generalize, and the generalization is faulty, and it doesn't help us to achieve the truth. Think about my example about dogs with 3 legs. I see a couple of dogs with 3 legs, and I conclude that all dogs have 3 legs, but that's not true. So that's where these simple rules of thumb or biases can get in the way of trying to achieve our goal of reaching the truth. So in this presentation, we're going to look at perceptual biases, cognitive biases, and memory biases. We're going to look at a few examples of each of these. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, but just a little sample to give you a sense of how what you know may not be so. The study of perception, cognition, and memory really is the domain of psychology. And this investigation into biases and the way in which our perceptual faculties and the way our mind distorts information is studied by cognitive psychologists. However, their results overlap what we do in philosophy in our analysis of the logical flaws in arguments, for example, because they're both different ways of coming at the issue of critical thinking. What are some of the things that derail our critical thinking and prevent us from reaching sound conclusions? So, when we're investigating these kinds of aspects of thought, when we are thinking about our thinking processes, what we are doing is called metacognition. That word meta indicates a kind of a stepping back, if you will. So cognition is thinking, but metacognition would be stepping back and examining our thinking processes, our perceptual processes. Why do we want to do this? Well, if we can learn the ways in which unconsciously or consciously, our brains distort information, then that can help us to more reliably reach true conclusions because we'll be aware of the possible faulty outcomes that we might achieve. So metacognition is a tool for helping us achieve the truth. So let's begin by looking at sensory perception. We have sensory organs like eyes and ears, for example, that bring us information about the world outside of our heads, more or less. And this information comes to us through our senses and then is processed by our brain. Now, one of the most important things that our brains do is filter and ignore a lot of the data that comes in. We're aware of only a very, very tiny slice of the possible information that is being presented to us in our environment. If we actually saw or heard or felt all of the possible sensations in any given moment, it would be so much information we would be overloaded. And so what our brains do is filter out a lot of this, what it perceives as irrelevant material, organizes the data into a meaningful pattern. Now, this is all very useful, of course, but sometimes the process goes wrong. And we're going to examine a few ways in which sensory perception can be misleading, and it should be something that we need to be cautious about. One thing that philosophers have been thinking about for a couple of thousand years is sensory perception. And there's a naive view of sensory perception that people hold that most philosophers would reject. Here's the naive view, that our senses present us direct contact with the world as it actually is. This is not the case. Now, to make you aware of how this functions, let's do a little thought experiment. Let's imagine that we're standing out in a field. It's a bright sunny day, and in the middle of this field is a tree, a single tree. Make it a pine tree. It really doesn't matter. Okay? So now, I tell you to look at the tree, and I'll look at it too. So we're looking at the tree. What do we see? Well, the naive person would say, I see the tree. I am seeing reality. And what I'm seeing is a green pine tree looking object that is very large right there in front of me. Now, what philosophers came to realize, and this started to really become a topic of conversation in the middle 1600s, early 1700s, what we started to realize is that that view is completely false. Because really, what is it that we're seeing? Well, we're not seeing the tree. What we're seeing is something taking place inside of our brains. Our eyes are registering frequencies of light that are bouncing off objects in the world. And these frequencies of light and these photons strike our eyes and become a nerve impulse that goes into our brain, and then our brain has to take this data and reconstruct it into a picture. So when you're standing out in a field and you're seeing a tree, the tree you're not seeing is the tree you are seeing is not reality, but rather a picture of the tree that your brain has reconstructed based on data presented to it by your senses. So the tree that you're seeing is actually inside your mind. Now, this leads to all kinds of philosophical problems, which you would probably talk about in great detail in an introduction to philosophy class. But the point I want to make here is that what this picture of perception entails is that perception is not passive. It may be an unconscious process. We may not be aware of it, but what's going on is our brains are constructing the reality around us. And I think that a little reflection on this makes a lot of sense, because this would explain why we can dispute or disagree about perceptual experiences that we're having simultaneously. We could both look at the tree, and I might see it as being bluish green, and you might look at it and see it as being more greenish blue, and then we can argue about the color of the tree. And the reason why this happens is we're not talking about the same tree. I'm talking about the tree in my brain, and you're talking about the tree in your brain, and who's to say which, if any of us, is properly constructing the picture of the tree? And so you can see how perception can be distorted and can lead to a lot of disagreements. You probably don't remember the internet controversy about what color this dress was, but for a couple of weeks back, a few years ago, everybody was all on fire about what color is the dress. Is it beige and white, or is it black and blue? And this photograph doesn't do justice to the potential ambiguity in color, but some people saw it one way, other people saw it another way, and everybody was all amazed by this result, which philosophers had been talking about for about 2,000 years. Yes, we don't perceive the world as it actually is, and this shouldn't surprise us. So the point here is to just make us aware of the subjective variation of sensory perception and the possibilities for distortion. Because our brains have to reconstruct a coherent picture by excluding information and selecting information and emphasizing certain information, there's a lot of potential for distortion and for drawing faulty conclusions. So that's one thing we need to keep in mind. These ways in which our brains construct a picture of reality follow rules, and the rules may be useful for survival, but the rules don't necessarily tell us the truth about how things are. So one of the things I'm trying to do here is to make you a little bit more skeptical than you might already be, by trying to show you that our perceptual faculties aren't necessarily as reliable as we may think they are. One fun way to make this point is by the use of optical illusions. Optical illusions can happen because they take advantage of the way our brains construct perceptual experiences, and they trick our brains into seeing something that isn't actually there. So let's take a look at a couple of optical illusions, and I'll point out some of the ways in which our brains do this. So here's a painting by Salvador Dali, the famous Spanish surrealist from the 20th century, showing a young woman, apparently a young woman, at a desk wearing a red head covering, reading a letter. Now, if you look at it very carefully, it shouldn't be very difficult to see the woman bent over the desk reading the letter. Now, some people instantly also see that this is a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. Some people can't see this at all. Some people see it instantly, and others need to make a cognitive shift in point of view. This is an ambiguous image, which means it can mean one thing or appear one way, and then if your brain makes a shift, it can appear another way. So to help guide you, if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about here about Abraham Lincoln, the clues would be that her shoulder and the shawl that she's wearing would be Abraham Lincoln's nose. And in the red head covering, you would see his eye, one of his eyes, and then his beard and his lips would be down below, and his face will pop into your perceptual world, and this can be very, very startling. Dali was a real master at doing these kinds of paintings with double images. And what this tells us, therefore, is that what we see is in part the result of what we expect to see. And that's why at the beginning of this slide, I talked about right away that this is a woman reading a letter, to plant that idea in your mind so you would see it that way, and then lead you to see the other image, and I hope you can see both images now, so that you come to realize that what we are perceiving is in part a result of decisions and conscious and sometimes unconscious processes that determine how we interpret the data that we are experiencing by means of our senses. Now, I'm going to move to another slide, which is a kind of a fun experiment. and I want to explain it to you first so that you're prepared. So the next slide is going to be an example of an after image illusion, okay? And what you're going to see is on the left side of the screen an image of a woman's face, but it's like a photo negative. You don't see any colors. And on the tip of her nose is a white dot. Now, the other half of the screen is just white. It's just a white blank area. So what I want you to do when I flip to the next slide is for about 5 seconds just stare intently at the dot on the woman's nose, and then when I tell you, shift your eyes over to the white blank portion of the screen, and maybe something cool will happen. Ready? Stare at the dot. Now shift to the right, and what do you see? Did you see the color picture of the woman's face? I'm still seeing it actually. It works pretty good on the small screen. It works really well on the big screen in a dark classroom. But the point here is that by means of fatiguing the rods and cones in your eyes, I was able to manipulate your brain to actually have a hallucination. Most of you probably have seen a picture. Now this is very interesting because there's no picture there. So this tells you that visual experiences are not necessarily visual experiences of things in the world. Sometimes these are simply visual experiences that are taking place within our brains. So this is a nice example of an optical illusion that shows us the constructive kind of active role of creating visual perception. Here's another optical illusion. Take a look at the checkerboard. There are two squares, one labeled A, one labeled B. And the question is, which square is darker in color, A or B? Now, looking at this, most people would say A is darker than B. Let's see if that's actually the case. When we remove the intervening checkerboard square, we see that the colors are not actually as different as we may initially interpreted them to be. And the reason why they looked so different in the first place is because we are viewing them under the contrasting experiences of the tiles that they are next to, which gives us the impression that A is darker because it's surrounded by white tiles and B is lighter because it's surrounded by dark tiles. And so it makes A and B look much more different than they actually are. So this tells us that the context in which we perceive something can have a very dramatic effect on how it is perceived. There are innumerable perceptual errors, and I can only cover just a few here to give you an idea of how interesting this is, but some of my favorites are listed here. The first one is temporal synchronization. This is a really interesting activity that our brain performs on sensory data. Let's say, for example, that you are, I don't know, 20 feet away from an audience and you're performing on stage, and you finish your performance and they start to clap. Well, you can see them clapping and you can hear them clapping, and it appears as though these two things are happening at the same time. But we know that you're perceiving the visual information of their clapping much more rapidly than the sound of their clapping, because light moves much, much faster than sound does, than sound waves do. However, what our brains do is sync up these two uneven streams of data so they appear to be happening simultaneously. This is temporal synchronization. Okay. And it's something that our brains do all the time. Sometimes this is brought to our attention, like for example, if you're at a baseball game and you see a hitter hit the ball, and then it takes a little while before you actually hear the sound of the bat hitting the ball, because these are two streams of data traveling at different speeds. Now that's an example where our brains do not sync up the two events because they're separated far enough where that would be even more disturbing and distorting. But in ordinary cases, sound and vision are often perceived as happening simultaneously. Inattentional blindness is something else. This is where, when we're intently focusing on something, something can appear within our visual field that it should be obvious, but because we are so focused on what we're doing, we don't actually perceive this thing that should be obvious. There are some famous videos on YouTube that talk about this. There's one where you're asked to pay very close attention to the number of people coming onto a stage and leaving a stage, and you have to be very alert, and you're counting the people going back and forth. And what you don't see is that about halfway through the video, someone in a bear suit walks across the screen. And it's obvious when you know it, but it's amazing that when I show these videos in class, there is a significant number of students, up to maybe a half the class in some cases, who never see the bear because they're so focused on the task that is given that they become blind to other things that are actually in their visual field, but they're not conscious of. And then the last thing in this list is one of my favorites, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about this. This is the phenomenon called pareidolia. And let's talk about what pareidolia is in the next slide. So just FYI, I found the video of the bear, and they call it the monkey business illusion, but it's inattentional blindness. So I put the link in here, and I wanted to point out something really very interesting because we're going to talk about memory in a little bit. I remembered that the video asks you to count people going off the stage and coming on the stage, but that is not the case. What actually takes place is these people are passing a ball around, and you're supposed to count how many times they pass the ball around. So there's an example where I thought I remembered something one way, and it turns out to be something completely different. So we'll have to be cautious about memory as well, as we will soon see. All right, so pareidolia. This is where we see apparently meaningful patterns in meaningless data. For example, seeing a face in the clouds, or seeing some patterns on a tile that look like a star or something like that. So it's imposing meaningful patterns on information that is typically meaningless. Now, it's easy to understand how in a dangerous environment where you're trying to survive, this could be a very useful thing, right? If you hear certain noises, but you can't see the cause of the noise, it might make sense to interpret that in a certain way, simply so that you avoid a dangerous situation. And we can see how this can create the idea that there are faces in the sky, or that the trees are talking to us, or other elements of what we might call mythological thinking. One of the things we tend to see the most is the human face. And this makes perfect sense, because being able to recognize faces is, of course, an obvious and important tool of survival. To be able to recognize the group to which you belong, to be able to recognize your enemies, of course, would be very, very important. And faces are one of the first things that our brains imprint on when we are infants. So clearly this is an image that is very deeply implanted, and a large portion of our brains is devoted, in fact, to recognizing faces. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. However, sometimes it can lead us to draw faulty conclusions. Let's take a look at a few examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Here's a photograph from the moon's surface that shows us what is obviously a relic constructed by an ancient alien civilization. This is a statue in the form of a face that is intended to be a communication to us about their existence and that we're not alone in the universe. Well, that's at least what the internet would like you to believe. Actually, this is just the photograph of the top of a mountain where the sun is at an angle, so it's casting shadows, and it just happens to look like a human face. It isn't a human face. In fact, if you look at it from a very different angle, it just looks like a mountain. But we see it as a face because that's one of the things we do. So Pseudoscience loves to exploit these kinds of images because they're so easy to create. I've seen images of what was supposed to be a rat on Mars, which is obviously just a rock that we're perceiving as a rat. But this is an example of what our brains do. Our brains look for patterns, and we see them even when they're not really there. Photos of ghosts are the same kind of thing, and I'm using the word ghost in scare quotes. Here's an example of two young children having a nice time picnicking down by the river. Little do they know that they are menaced by an ominous presence lurking behind them, a ghost rising out of the water. Well, no, not really. It's just an illusion where light is striking through the trees on the opposite bank, hitting the water, and it just happens to look like a face. To me, it happens to look a little bit like Edgar Allan Poe, and I don't know what it looks like to you, but it's whatever it is, it's not a ghost. However, it's really easy to see these human images in photographs. We see this a lot in double exposures, which I don't think really happen that much anymore in the digital age, but it used to be a time when you would expose film to take a picture, and sometimes the film wouldn't advance in the camera, and you would take another picture, and they would be superimposed on each other because the film didn't move, and it looks, in some cases, quite startling. But it's not really a ghost, it's just an optical illusion. And I'm going to conclude perceptual illusions with probably my favorite. This is the miraculous grilled cheese sandwich upon which an image of the Virgin Mary appears. This is an actual religious artifact that turned up on someone's stove one day, and it was bought for thousands of dollars, and I think it's in some museum somewhere. You could actually go see it. In fact, you can buy toasters on Amazon that imprint images on your food now. So it started a whole industry. And I guess if you really look very hard, you might be able to see something in the center that looks vaguely like a human face. Um, but again, it's just an example of pareidolia. We're seeing something there, but that doesn't mean what we're seeing is actually there. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears and talk about thinking a little bit. We were talking about perception, which is one element of thinking, but now we're going to talk about drawing conclusions and reaching conclusions. We're going to talk about cognitive biases. Here, the discussion of biases isn't really referring to how we use the word bias in everyday life. We're not talking about people who are prejudiced, for example, or who are, racist or ageist or sexist or whatever. Those are biases also, and they're probably a result of some of these cognitive biases. But those are slightly different. Here, what we're talking about when we talk about cognitive biases are unconscious ways in which our brains organize information and draw conclusions, okay? And the way in which we interpret information. So these are important to understand because if they are in control of our thinking processes and they are deceptive or misleading, then that creates a much higher likelihood that we're going to draw faulty conclusions. So if we can become aware of these cognitive biases, we can, if not eliminate them, which I think is impossible, we can at least lessen their overall negative effect on our critical thinking. So earlier I talked about being out on the savannah and you see a lion and you run because you immediately conclude all lions are dangerous. Now, this is an example of a heuristic. A heuristic is simply a rule of thumb that we subconsciously apply. Like big things are dangerous, right? Big furry things are dangerous, for example. And in this particular case, you could see how useful it is to have these heuristics in place because they simplify complex decision-making processes and can lead to correct conclusions that are beneficial for survival. That's why I think that there are so few people who are really good at critical thinking because evolution does not select for them. Think about the person who sees the lion and goes, okay, let's not draw a hasty conclusion. Let's analyze this lion, this creature, and then try to determine if it's dangerous or not. Let's weigh all the alternatives. Those people got eaten. And so therefore there aren't a lot of them who have survived to reproduce. The people who survive to reproduce are the people who say, lion, run, and they survive, right? So heuristics are useful. However, they can also lead us to incorrect conclusions if we're not aware of them and how they influence our thinking. So let's take a look at some of the ways in which they do this. If you're really bored sometime or just curious, I encourage you to go to Wikipedia and type in list of cognitive biases. And what you're going to find is that there have been a lot of people very, very busy classifying cognitive biases. There are hundreds of them. Psychologists have been studying this for a very long time, and these lists are actually quite long and quite fascinating. And obviously, there's way too many to go over in this class, so I've just picked a few of the ways in which our brains unconsciously draw conclusions and organize information that can be situationally helpful, but can also lead to faulty conclusions if we follow them uncritically. For example, we are biased to think that biases don't affect us, that we are objective, whereas biases tend to only influence other people, that we are immune to their effects. And this is an example of what's called the blind spot bias. And it's named for the phenomenon that our eyes, right in the center of our visual field in each eye, there's a blind spot where the optic nerve attaches to the back of the eye. Fortunately, because we have two eyes, they work together and our brain fills in the missing information from these blind spots, and we perceive visually a complete world without any holes in it. So there are areas where we cannot actually see. Now, this is a metaphor for our inability to see ourselves in this respect, where we see bias in other people, but we don't see it as influencing our own beliefs. And this is a bias, right? We're biased in our own behalf in that respect. This is something we really need to be careful of because we are biased. Each of us is influenced by hundreds of unconscious cognitive and perceptual biases. So the idea that you're the only objective person and everybody else is biased is itself a bias that you need to address. Probably the most pervasive bias, certainly one of the top 10, is confirmation bias. This is where we tend to remember information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, and we don't notice or we rationalize away any information that does not confirm our beliefs. So this is how we filter information to reinforce our belief systems. Now, naturally, if we are doing this and we are unconscious of this, then we might think we're objective when in fact we are completely irrational because we're only perceiving the data that we secretly want to perceive. Now, you could see how this can affect scientific research, for example. And if you take psychology and study the research methods of setting up experiments, you can see how important it is to make sure that when you're running an experiment, you're not just picking the data that confirms the result you want to get. This can be, of course, the product of just dishonesty in research, but that's pretty rare. Usually it's just an unconscious tendency. We want to be right, and so we select the data that makes us right. And it's a really interesting experiment because you can actually manipulate this consciously if you want to. For example, spend a few minutes, when you're out in the world, observing people, and rather than seeing them as they are, try to perceive them with the implicit idea that all the people you see are actually people who've escaped from a maximum security prison, and they're all on the loose. Now, if you go and actually watch people's behavior with this idea in place, you're going to see behaviors that will confirm that belief. And that's an example of confirmation bias. So everything they do might look suspicious because they're trying to avoid capture, let's say, or you might interpret innocent actions as violent or more aggressive than they actually are because your premise is that these people are escaped prisoners, right? So now you can see how this can affect our ability to function in society as well. Let's say you have a belief about old people, for example, among whom I would include myself. And so what you're going to see is that whether or not people of a certain age manifest certain behaviors, you're going to see them as manifesting those behaviors because that's your pre-existing belief. And this is where I was talking about earlier how these unconscious cognitive biases can actually be a source that creates certain social prejudices. For example, if you have certain beliefs about people of certain genders or of certain age groups or certain races, and you're a victim of confirmation bias, then all of your experiences with these people are going to be distorted by your pre-existing decisions about how these people are. And that's clearly going to have a negative consequence on your ability to interact with these people, but also to factually perceive the world as it is. So confirmation bias is a very important thing to be aware of and to try to avoid because it leads us to draw really faulty conclusions. If I were to make an argument that there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe on other planets than just the Earth, and I were to say something like, the reason for this conclusion is that the universe is very, very large, and so it just stands to reason that we wouldn't be the only inhabited planet with intelligent life. Most of you would accept that conclusion and probably think it's a pretty good argument. The universe is really big, and why should we think we're the only intelligent being? That seems kind of egocentric. However, that argument is really a really bad argument, and I don't think supports the idea that there's intelligent life in the universe whatsoever, in any way whatsoever. Here's an analogy. The oceans of the Earth are really big, and yet there's nothing in them that can write poetry, at least as far as we know. So why should the bigness of the oceans or the bigness of the universe matter at all? What you're actually doing is you're generalizing from a single case of intelligent life on one planet that there must be intelligent life on other planets. But that's a fallacy. That's called hasty generalization. And so therefore, I don't think the argument for intelligent life in the universe that I've given is a very good one. Now, there may be intelligent life in the universe. I don't know one way or the other. Neither does anybody else. But that particular argument is really bad. However, if you're the victim of belief bias, you might think it's a plausible argument because you agree with the conclusion. Even though the argument is really bad, you still want to accept it because you think the conclusion is plausible. But one of the things I've been trying to emphasize in this class is that whether or not you agree with the conclusion of an argument or whether or not you think it's plausible really doesn't matter at all. What matters is what's the evidence? Where do the premises lead us? And if the premises do not lead us to the conclusion, then our belief in that conclusion is unwarranted. And so this is one way in which our biases cause us to draw faulty conclusions and agree with arguments that we shouldn't actually agree with if we're thinking critically. Lots of people believe in astrology, which is the idea that the position of the stars at the exact moment of your birth determines, in many ways, who you are and what's going to happen in your life. That people are born into certain signs of the zodiac that contain their dominant personality traits. And so if you're born as a Pisces or an Aries, that's going to say something about who you are and how you act, right? And the problem with this belief is that it's false. And it's a function of what we call the Forer effect, which is also known as the Barnum effect, named after P.T. Barnum. And this is the tendency that we have to hear really vague general claims, especially when they're about us, as if they're really very accurate and very descriptive. Um, and this is a favorite of fortune tellers and other frauds who use this to give the illusion that they have certain magical powers. For example, a few years ago on television, there were a whole bunch of shows about people who claimed to be able to talk to dead people. And I thought these shows were an abomination because what these people were doing is basically a tactic used by con artists where they would say to people in the audience, I'm hearing someone from the other side who I believe died near a body of water, and the person in the audience would go, yes, yes, my uncle died on a ship or something. And what people don't realize is that almost everybody dies near a body of water because all human beings live near water. So it's a very vague general claim that we hear as if it's specifically directed to us. And this is the example of an example of the Forer effect, where we take these vague claims and hear them as if they're specifically tailored for our particular destiny, let's say, our particular personality. And so you pick up your horoscope and you read it, and it says something like, you tend to be critical of yourself. Try not to be so critical of yourself today. Or that you don't feel like you're being used to your total capacity in your job, or something like that. You have various personality weaknesses or social weaknesses, and so beware of these today. And you read your horoscope and you go, wow, that's really amazing because it just describes me perfectly. And so you go about your day. So the problem with these horoscopes is that they make claims like this, and there's a whole bunch of them listed here, that are more or less true of just about everybody in some degree or another. And it's really easy for us to see ourselves specifically referred to in these very, very vague and general claims. Um, and so if you look at a claim like, oh, I'll just pick one at random, you are disciplined and self-controlled on the outside, and yet you tend to be worrisome and insecure inside. Okay, well, that's pretty much everybody. Okay, everybody who has ever lived is in some way or another not presenting their 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 true inner self to the world, right? We put on a certain mask, if you will, a social mask. And so, yeah, we want to appear self-controlled, but, we tend to worry and be insecure and maybe be self-critical. This is true of everybody. That's why horoscopes tend to be so convincing, is because we hear these vague claims and we interpret them as if they're exactly about us. And that's what I was talking about earlier. This is the Forer effect. So beware of this. Beware of these vague claims when especially when you're visiting your favorite fortune teller, palm reader, or psychic. So it's important to know about cognitive biases, and I urge you to take a look at that list in Wikipedia, the list of cognitive biases, and I think you're going to find it really very interesting, and maybe you'll see some biases in there that you commit yourselves. The importance of critical thinking is not to eliminate cognitive biases, because I don't think this is something we can do. These are in many ways hardwired into our brains, and we are socialized to think in certain ways. But if we can become aware of these biases and how they affect our thinking, then these subconscious influences can at least be somewhat modified and mitigated. So if we are aware of cognitive biases, we can examine our beliefs and test them against reality, if not reality as it really is, at least a closer reality than we typically deal with, in order to minimize the effects of these biases. So in the module, I put a short reading that has, I think, 12 biases in addition to those that we looked at here, just to kind of supplement the the discussion here if you're interested. And also, of course, you could go to that Wikipedia link and take a look at those as well. Now we're going to transition to our last category, which are memory biases. Memory is the recall of data or events that have happened in the past. And this is something we are really quite naive about. We tend to think of memory as being kind of a recording, maybe like on a hard drive of a computer, and that every time we bring up a memory, we're accessing a file and remembering it in exactly the same way. But that's not the case. Memory is actually an active process, and our memories are constantly being rewritten and altered every time we recall them and over the passage of time. Even the way a memory is constructed is in part an active process that our brains do. And it's by no means merely a passive recording of data, like a film camera recording an image. So let's look at some of the ways in which memories can be distorted. So I want you to take about 10 seconds and look over the words on this list and try to remember them. So one of the important ideas that I'm trying to convey to you is that our minds are very active in the creation of our mental world. Our perceptions, our memories, and our thoughts are not passive. They're the result of our brains organizing data, and just because we see something or think something or remember something doesn't mean that that is what has actually occurred. Let's see if we could test this hypothesis. So I asked you to look at a list of words. How many of you remember seeing the word foot? Think about it. Are you very confident that you saw the word foot in that list of words? Well, let's take a look at that list of words again and see what the result is. Do you remember seeing the word foot? Well, you remembered falsely. That idea was suggested by the words in the list, but the word does not appear. And that's an example how a memory can be constructed by means of suggestion. Here, the words in these lists suggest the idea of feet, but the word doesn't actually appear. It's our brain filling in the link that joins all of these terms together that we are actually remembering. So this is one of the ways in which we have to be cautious about memory. Let's look at a few other ways in which our memories can be biased as well. False memory bias, as the name implies, is when an act of imagination is mistaken for memory. Someone may remember something as having happened, and they may remember it very, very strongly and be very, very confident, but it may not have happened. It might have been an act of imagination that is now being taken as a memory. There are some really interesting cases of this. Let's take a look at one. One famous case involves Brian Williams, who was the lead anchor on the nightly news for NBC, and he would often give speeches where he would talk about his career as a reporter and his being in very dangerous places to get stories. And some of the stories he told turned out to be false. And it wasn't the case that he was lying. He wasn't intentionally misrepresenting the situation. He actually remembered certain events occurring. For example, he remembered being in a helicopter in a war zone and getting shot at by some enemy soldiers. He remembered it, but it didn't actually occur. And this is an example of how an act of imagination can be converted into a memory. And I remember him, no pun intended, talking about this, and he was actually quite shocked. He was actually obviously embarrassed about it, but for him it was a very unusual experience because he remembered this stuff happening. It wasn't like he was making up stories, and yet they never occurred. Remembering something is a lot like telling a story. When we tell stories, like at a party, for example, we don't tell the story exactly the same way every single time. We change it for our audience. We emphasize certain elements. We embellish certain details. We fill in certain missing pieces of information to make the story more coherent. Well, this is kind of what our memories do. when we remember something, we're trying to make it more coherent than it may actually have been. And we're trying to fit it in with the current state of our lives as well. So we may alter certain details if, for example, the way we have viewed the world has changed, then the way we remember certain events is going to take on different meanings as well. And so we have to be careful with memories. This is not to say by any means that memory is always faulty and unreliable, but it is to say that we need to be cautious that what we remember may not have happened exactly as we remember it. So let's conclude our discussion of memory with just a look at a few biases. There are many, many more that you can find, but here are just a couple. The egocentric bias is a tendency to recall the past in a self-serving way. This is not necessarily a conscious undertaking, but as we recall the past, we have a tendency to view our role in the past event in a more positive light than it may actually have occurred. We may remember that we acted more virtuously or more responsibly or in some way that makes us appear better. Suggestibility is a very big problem with memory. This is where you're asked a leading question that causes you to alter the way you remember something. Like in an interrogation where perhaps someone asks you, so you're a witness to a crime, so you saw the person who committed this crime, and that person had a tattoo, right? And now you're searching your memory banks and you go, yeah, I guess that person did have a tattoo, but you didn't actually remember the person that way before the suggestion was given to you. And this is the way in which a memory can be constructed by ideas being suggested to us. The Google effect is an interesting memory bias, and this is kind of the opposite of a memory bias. This is more of a forgetting bias, which is that we tend to forget information if we can easily find it online. So therefore, this is affecting what it is we actually choose to retain in our memory and what we choose to neglect or ignore. And we do this because there are other memory storage, let's say, technologies that we can appeal to. And finally, the humor effect is the tendency to remember information presented in a humorous manner. And this seems to be something that could easily be demonstrated. If something is presented to you and it's funny, then you have a tendency to enjoy the presentation of the information. That makes you more attentive. And of course, you're going to learn more. You're going to remember more if you're more attentive. And so I think that this is an interesting kind of tendency. And I want to just emphasize here that it also highlights the fact that biases aren't necessarily bad. This is a bias, but you could see how this has a positive effect. So a bias is just a tendency. Some tendencies are helpful and some tendencies are harmful, and that's an important distinction to keep in mind in memory biases, but also in cognitive biases as well. So what we want to do is become aware of how biases can affect us and our perceptions and our thoughts about the world. We're never going to eliminate biases, but we can reduce their negative effects by, first of all, understanding them, and then by being committed to only form beliefs that we are justified by the evidence to believe. And that is justified after a careful review of the evidence and reasoning in a careful manner about it, rather than jumping to conclusions or drawing faulty conclusions based on whatever bias happens to be affecting us. So it's a matter of awareness. We're never going to eliminate these effects on our thinking, but if we know about them, they will have less of a negative effect in the future. No one likes to think they're biased. Everybody likes to believe that they're objective, that they consider the facts, that they're rational. But we are all biased, and these biases are unconscious in most cases. They're part of the way our brains are made. And so therefore, if we think that we're not biased, that in itself is a bias that stands in the way of being a critical thinker. So remember, the belief that you are not biased is perhaps the most difficult bias to overcome, but it's one that's important to strive to overcome.